Measuring to a quarter of an inch. This is what we're talking about, using a ruler to measure. I'm going to show you how to do it here using some drawings, because on this ruler there's actually more markings than we need to measure to a quarter of an inch. You can measure all the way up to an eighth or a 16th. For us, we're only going to a quarter of an inch. So, the first thing I want to talk about is how this relates to a number line and fractions on a number line. It's just like a number line from 0 to say 3 or how many ever inches you're measuring, where each whole number represents an inch. And then in between each inch, you have a half marker. That's going to be your biggest line in between the 2 inches, is the half marker. So between 0 and 1, this would be half an inch. And then between 1 and 2, this would be 1.5 inches. And then between 2 and 3, it would be 2.5. Between 3 and 4 would be 4.5, 4 and 5, 5.5. Between any two numbers, it's going to be like 1 and 2, 1.5. So 0 and 1, just half. Keep that in mind. There's a half-inch marker between every two whole numbers, or whole inches. Then, in between each half, there is a quarter of an inch marker. It's going to be your second biggest one. So right here between 0 and half, you have 1/4. And then this would be 2/4, which is equal to 1/2. And then here you have 3/4. Between 1 and 1/2, you have 1 and 1/4. 1 and 3/4. And here would be 2/4 or 1/2. Same thing between 2 and 3. Right here would be 2 and 1/4, 2 and 2/4, or 1 or 2.5. And then right here would be 2 and 3/4. Now in these between 0 and 1, I drew a couple extra markers here. These would be where your 1/8 inch markers would be. So on a regular standard ruler that you get at the store, most of them that you see will have 1/8 inch markers on it. So in real life, when you're using this, in terms of what we'll be practicing, ignore these little markers. Plus, there's even smaller ones in between the eighths. Those are 1/16ths of an inch. And we have to ignore those two. We're focused on the big one in the middle, the halves, and then the slightly smaller one in between the halves, the quarter inches. So, measuring objects. Here I have a ruler drawn just like you would see it. There's nothing, a lot of times it doesn't even say 0 at the end. And then there's a 1, 2, 3, and a 4 way down here. And in between there's markers. The big one represents a half, and then the smaller one represents a quarter. So you can see that this worm goes 1, 2, 3 inches, and then it goes right about here. It's actually a little bit past this halfway mark. However, the measurement would be 3.5 inches. And this is because measurement is very rarely an exact science, or we get that exact measurement perfectly, especially just with using our eye and a ruler. It may never quite line up perfectly. Although we try the best we can when we're taking something like a worm, trying to stretch that out on a ruler, it can be hard to measure that. In this case, it is about 3.5 inches, so we just say 3.5 inches. That's the closest quarter of an inch that we have. Here's another example of a tricky object. Say I'm measuring something like a stapler. Well, you might see a picture like this drawn, and you have 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch. Again, note, it doesn't always necessarily have a 0 labeled. There's an assumption that this is 0 inches at the end of the ruler. So I know that this stapler comes from here, goes all the way out, and it's right at 4 inches, it looks. But you have to consider this. If I look up at the top, and I measure down from where this furthest sticks out, it's right about 4. Well, here would be 4.5. So it's right between 4 and 4.5, or 4 and 1/4 inches. Be careful on problems like this, because the stapler here should be 4 and 1/4, but something tells me if I was making a multiple choice test, I would put 4 as a choice to see who got tricked by not looking that it actually goes further than 4 inches up near the top. Offset measurements. Now these are tricky ones because I have my ruler, starts at 0 down here, 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, And I have a little rectangle here I'm trying to measure. Well, this rectangle lines up past 3 and then goes past 3.5 to 3 3/4. And that might be my first instinct, 3 3/4, because I'm at 3/4 inch here, 3 here. But I forgot. I didn't start measuring at the end of the ruler. So I'm not at 3 3/4 yet. I started at 1. I really just went 1 inch, 2 inch, and then 3/4. 1, 1, and 3/4. So I'm actually at 2 3/4 inch. You can't count this inch here because there's nothing there. I'm not actually measuring it. I just lined up this rectangle on a different part of the ruler, which sometimes needs to happen depending on what you're measuring. And if you can't get your ruler in the right spot to measure it, sometimes you have to start at like 1 and then measure from 1 to 3 3/4 and know that that's really only 2 3/4 of an inch. Let's label this inches. Here's our learning target. I can use a ruler to measure lengths to the nearest whole, half, and 1/4 inch. How long is the pencil? So I've drawn a pencil for you. I've drawn a ruler, marked off the 1/4 inches. 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, and 5 inches are labeled, but just like you might normally see, these little markers aren't labeled, so you're going to figure out what each marker is worth. Look at the pencil, where does it start, where does it end, and tell me how long is the pencil.